"If you're expecting a romance, you took the wrong bus," Liam said, his voice like gravel grinding under a heavy steel-toed boot. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the desolate stretch of Montana highway, his jaw locked tight enough to crack teeth. Olivia tightened her grip on her fraying suitcase, her knuckles turning white. "I'm not expecting romance, Liam. I'm expecting a roof." "Good." He finally turned. His eyes were dead, hollowed out by a grief so heavy it seemed to suck the oxygen from the truck cab. "Keep your head down. Do your chores. Don't ask about the locked door down the hall. We survive the agency's mandatory 6 months. You get your debt paid and you leave. Understood." Chapter 1. The Weight of the Silence. The drive to the Blackwood Ranch took 2 hours, and neither of them spoke another word. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a physical entity sitting between them on the cracked leather bench of Liam's 1990 Ford F-150. Olivia kept her eyes pinned to the passenger window, watching the jagged snow-capped peaks of the Absaroka Range swallow the fading afternoon sun. She was 26, but her bones felt 80. The modern matchmaking contract she had signed in a dingy Chicago office, an agency pairing desperate city women with isolated, labor-starved ranchers, was folded perfectly in her coat pocket. It was a transaction. He needed a housekeeper and someone to satisfy the bank's requirement for a dual-income loan modification. She needed to vanish from the grid. Liam shifted gears, the heavy transmission groaning. He was a massive man, shoulders broad enough to block out the window light, dressed in a faded flannel and denim coated in a fine layer of pale dust. His profile was etched in granite, rough and unyielding. Not once did he check his rearview mirror. Not once did he sigh. He simply drove with the mechanical, soulless precision of a man who had forgotten how to feel. The truck jolted violently as they turned off the asphalt onto a rutted dirt road. Olivia gasped, her shoulder slamming against the window. "Sorry," Liam muttered. It was the first word in 80 miles. It sounded as if it hurt his throat to speak it. "It's fine," Olivia lied, pressing her hand against her side where a yellowish bruise still lingered beneath her ribs. The ranch emerged from the twilight like a ghost ship. It was sprawling, magnificent in its architecture, but undeniably decaying. The main house was a 2-story log structure with a wraparound porch, but the paint was peeling, and one of the porch pillars leaned precariously. The fences in the distance were warped. Liam parked the truck near the front steps, cut the engine, and stepped out into the biting wind without looking back. Olivia scrambled to follow, her hands trembling from the cold and the residual adrenaline of the last 4 days. She reached into the truck bed to grab her suitcase, a cheap, hard shell thing she'd bought at a thrift store. She misjudged the weight. As she yanked it toward her, the handle snapped. Olivia stumbled backward, her heel catching on a jagged rock in the driveway. She went down hard, scraping her palms against the frozen dirt. The suitcase hit the ground with a sickening crack, the flimsy latch giving way. Like a burst dam, her meager life spilled across the Montana dirt. Cheap cotton underwear, a battered paperback novel, a half-empty bottle of generic aspirin, and a framed, cracked photograph of a younger version of herself standing next to a woman who looked entirely too exhausted to be smiling. Olivia froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. In Chicago, a mistake like this, a loud noise, an inconvenience, meant a backhand across the face. She squeezed her eyes shut, instinctively raising an arm to protect her head. Footsteps crunched on the dirt, heavy and deliberate. They stopped right in front of her. Olivia held her breath, waiting for the yell, the curse, the strike. Instead, a shadow fell over her. When she opened her eyes, Liam was kneeling in the dirt. His massive, calloused hands that looked capable of snapping timber, were carefully picking up her scattered belongings. He didn't look at her underwear. He didn't linger on the photograph. He just gathered the items with a terrifying blank efficiency. He placed the items back into the broken shell, snapped the broken halves together, and tucked the suitcase under his arm. Finally, he looked down at her. His face was a mask of absolute, chilling indifference. "Ice on the ground," he said flatly. "Watch your step." He stood and walked into the dark house, leaving Olivia sitting in the dirt, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the quiet vastness of the mountains. The house smelled of pine needles, old coffee, and stagnant air. It felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. That night, Olivia was shown to a small guest room on the ground floor. True to his word at the bus station, Liam had paused in the hallway, pointed a long scarred finger at a closed oak door at the far end, and said, "Never open that?" She hadn't slept. Every creak of the house, every howl of the wind outside, sounded like footsteps on a Chicago fire escape. By 5 in the morning, the cold drove her from the thin blankets. She crept into the kitchen, desperate to prove herself useful. The contract required her to maintain the household. If she failed, the agency would revoke her placement, and she would be sent back. Back to the city. Back to him. The kitchen was remarkably clean, but in a way that suggested it was rarely used. Dust coated the tops of the cabinets. Olivia found a tin of coffee grounds and an old percolator. Her hands were still shaking, a tremor that hadn't left her since she boarded the Greyhound 4 days ago. She filled the pot with water, her mind racing. She needed Liam to see her as an asset. She needed to be perfect. Reaching into the cabinet above the sink, she searched for mugs. Her fingers brushed against something in the back corner, pushed far out of the way. She pulled it down. It was a delicate hand-painted ceramic mug, covered in little blue cornflowers. It was the only object in the kitchen with any color. She set it on the counter, turning back to the stove to turn on the burner. As she pivoted, the oversized sleeve of her borrowed sweater caught the handle of the mug. Time seemed to slow down. Olivia lunged for it, her fingers brushing the smooth ceramic. But she was too late. Smash! The sound was like a gunshot in the silent house. The blue cornflower mug shattered into dozens of jagged pieces across the faded linoleum floor. Olivia stopped breathing. The blood drained from her face. Heavy, rapid footsteps echoed down the wooden stairs. Liam appeared in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed in his work clothes, his chest heaving slightly. His eyes darted to Olivia, then down to the floor. When he saw the blue shards, something in his face broke. It wasn't an explosive break. It was a microscopic fracturing. His jaw tightened so violently the muscle jumped beneath his skin. The deadness in his eyes was suddenly replaced by a storm of raw, unadulterated agony. "I'm sorry," Olivia whispered, her voice cracking. She immediately dropped to her knees, disregarding the sharp edges, frantically scraping the pieces together with her bare hands. "I'm so sorry, I didn't see it. I'll buy another one, I swear." "Stop!" His voice was a harsh whisper. "I can fix it with glue," she babbled, a small cut opening on her index finger, blooming crimson. "I'm clumsy. I'm so stupid. Please don't." I said stop. Olivia flinched violently, falling backward against the cabinets, her knees pulled to her chest, arms up. Silence slammed back into the room. Liam stood frozen, staring at her defensive posture. He looked at her raised arms, her cowering frame, the blood dripping from her finger. The anger in his eyes drained away, replaced by a dark, terrible realization of what she expected him to do. He didn't speak. He stepped around her, opened a drawer, and pulled out a dustpan and brush. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt on the floor. He swept up the broken cornflowers. Every scrape of the brush sounded like a eulogy. He stood, dumped the pieces into the trash, and walked to the sink. He grabbed a clean dish towel, ran it under cold water, and wrung it out. He walked back to Olivia, who was still pressed against the cabinets, trembling. He didn't offer his hand to help her up. He just tossed the damp towel onto her lap. "Clean your cut," he said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion once more. "And don't touch anything else in this house unless I tell you to." He turned and walked out the back door. Olivia sat on the floor, pressing the cold towel to her bleeding finger, realizing with a sinking dread that she hadn't just broken a mug. She had broken a piece of a ghost. By noon, the guilt was a suffocating weight in Olivia's chest. She couldn't stay inside the silent, oppressive house. She bundled up in her threadbare winter coat and ventured out into the freezing Montana air. She found Liam by the stables. He was pitching hay, his movements rhythmic and punishing, as if he were trying to exhaust a demon inside his own muscles. He ignored her approach. "I want to help," Olivia said, her voice swallowed by the wind. Liam didn't break his rhythm. "Go inside. The contract says I'm supposed to work," she insisted, taking a step closer. "I can't just sit in there." He finally stopped, leaning on the pitchfork. His breath plumed in the frigid air. "You're a liability out here. You break things inside. Out here, things will break you." "I can carry water," she said stubbornly, pointing toward a stack of heavy rubber buckets near the spigot. Liam stared at her for a long, calculating moment. "Fine. Fill the troughs in the lower pasture. Don't slip." Olivia marched to the spigot, determined. She filled 2 buckets. They were agonizingly heavy, pulling at her weak shoulders. She managed to haul them out to the lower pasture, where 3 massive, intimidating quarter horses watched her with mild curiosity. She approached the large metal trough. It was rimmed with ice. She lifted the first bucket, her boots slipping slightly in the muddy snow. She poured the water in successfully. Confidence surged in her chest. "I can do this. I'm not useless." She grabbed the second bucket. As she hoisted it over the rim of the trough, one of the horses, a massive roan, stepped forward and snorted loudly right next to her ear. Olivia jumped. Her foot caught a patch of solid ice. Her legs flew out from under her. She didn't just drop the bucket. She pitched forward, arms flailing, and slammed chest first into the metal rim of the trough, tumbling head over heels straight into the freezing, ice-chunk-filled water. The shock of the cold was instantaneous and paralyzing. It punched the air from her lungs. She thrashed, swallowing a mouthful of dirty water, panicking as her heavy coat immediately soaked through and anchored her down. A curse rang out across the pasture. Before Olivia could figure out which way was up, 2 massive hands gripped the back of her coat and hauled her upward. She was yanked out of the trough and deposited onto the snowy ground like a drowned rat. She gasped for air, coughing violently, pushing wet hair out of her eyes. She looked up. Liam was standing over her. He was breathing hard, his hands resting on his hips. He looked at her dripping, shivering form, covered in mud and horsehair, her teeth already beginning to chatter loudly. For a fraction of a second, the hardened lines around Liam's mouth twitched. The corners of his lips strained, fighting an invisible battle against years of programmed stoicism. It wasn't a smile, not yet, but it was the absolute closest thing to amusement his face had seen in a lifetime. The twitch vanished instantly. "I told you not to slip," he grunted, reaching down to grab her by the upper arm and haul her to her feet. I didn't mean to," Olivia stammered, her jaw shaking uncontrollably. "Get to the house. Take a hot shower before you catch pneumonia," he ordered, letting go of her arm as if her touch burned. Before Olivia could take a step, the crunch of gravel echoed from the main driveway. Liam's posture instantly shifted. The microscopic softening in his demeanor evaporated, replaced by a rigid, dangerous tension. Olivia turned her head. A sleek, black SUV, completely out of place on the rugged dirt road, was rolling to a stop near the porch. Liam's hand instinctively dropped to the heavy iron wrench resting on the fence post beside him. "Go inside," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Now." "Who is that?" Olivia whispered, her blood running colder than the trough water. "Oh, the bank," Liam lied. But Olivia saw the way his eyes tracked the men stepping out of the vehicle. They didn't wear suits. They wore leather jackets, and they moved with the heavy, predatory swagger of men looking for a debt to collect. Olivia recognized that walk. It was the same walk the men in Chicago had. Her past hadn't just followed her. It had parked in his driveway. The 3 men who stepped out of the black SUV did not belong in the Absaroka range. They wore thin leather jackets, designer denim, and Chelsea boots that immediately sank into the muddy, freezing slush of the driveway. But what they lacked in proper outerwear, they made up for in predatory confidence. Olivia couldn't move. The freezing water from the trough had soaked through her wool coat, freezing her joints and sending violent, uncontrollable shudders through her spine. But the cold was nothing compared to the ice in her veins as the lead man, a broad-shouldered enforcer named Vince, whom she recognized from Marcus's underground poker room in Chicago, locked eyes with her. "Well, look at this," Vince said, his breath pluming in the air. He flashed a smile that didn't reach his dead, calculating eyes. "Marcus spent a lot of money tracking that agency you used, Livy. You're a hard girl to find. Get back in the car," Liam said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, resonant rumble, quieter than the wind, yet it commanded the open space with terrifying authority. Vince finally turned his attention to the massive rancher standing between him and Olivia. He looked Liam up and down, taking in the faded flannel and the dirt-stained jeans, and chuckled. "Relax, cowboy. We aren't here for your cows. The girl owes our boss 60 grand. We're just repossessing her." Vince took a step forward, his hand drifting casually toward the bulge inside his leather jacket. His two companions fanned out, their boots crunching on the gravel. "I won't tell you twice," Liam said. He didn't shift his stance. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just held the heavy iron wrench loosely in his right hand, the metal resting against his thigh. "And I won't tell you twice, Hick. Step aside, or I'll put a hollow point through your kneecap before I drag her into the—" Vince never finished the sentence. Liam didn't throw a punch. He simply moved with the devastating, explosive speed of a man used to wrestling 1,200-pound steers to the dirt. In a fraction of a second, he closed the gap. He swung the heavy iron wrench in a tight, brutal upward arc, catching Vince squarely under the wrist just as the man drew a black handgun. A sickening crack echoed across the pasture. Vince screamed, a high, reedy sound, as the gun flew from his shattered wrist and landed in the snow. Before the other two men could react, Liam pivoted. He grabbed Vince by the lapels of his leather jacket, lifted him entirely off the ground, and hurled his 200-pound frame backward into one of his approaching companions. They both went down in a tangle of limbs and mud. The third man froze, his hand halfway inside his jacket, staring at Liam. Liam didn't even look out of breath. He stepped slowly toward the third man, raising the wrench. His eyes were completely hollow, devoid of fear, devoid of hesitation. He looked like a man who had already lost everything and was perfectly willing to kill or die over a patch of dirt. "Montana has the castle doctrine," Liam stated, his voice dead flat. "You're trespassing on my land. You are armed. If I bury you in the lower pasture, the coyotes will scatter your bones before the sheriff ever bothers to file the paperwork." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Vince whimpering in the mud, clutching his mangled wrist. "Get in your car," Liam commanded. "If I ever see your faces on my road again, I won't aim for the wrist." The uninjured man scrambled backward, hauling Vince to his feet. They didn't say another word. They practically threw themselves into the SUV, the engine roaring as they threw it into reverse, fishtailing wildly down the dirt road until they vanished into the tree line. Liam stood completely still for a long moment, watching the dust settle. Then he turned to Olivia. She was on her knees in the snow, her lips a bruised shade of blue, shaking so violently her teeth were clacking together. She looked up at him, waiting for the anger, waiting for him to drag her to the highway and leave her there for bringing the syndicate to his door. Instead, he dropped the wrench, closed the distance between them, and scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed no more than a bundle of kindling. "Don't speak," he ordered, his jaw clenched tight. "Save your body heat." The interior of the house felt like an oven compared to the biting wind outside. Liam carried her straight past the kitchen and into the living room, depositing her roughly onto the large leather sofa in front of the stone fireplace. "Take the coat off," he barked, immediately turning his back to her to violently stoke the dying embers in the grate. He threw on 3 massive logs, the fire roaring to life. Olivia fumbled with the buttons of her soaked coat, but her fingers were numb, completely unresponsive. She let out a frustrated, pathetic sob, her wet clothes acting like an ice bath against her skin. Hearing her struggle, Liam turned. He cursed softly under his breath, stepped forward, and batted her useless hands away. With sharp, clinical efficiency, he unbuttoned the ruined wool coat and peeled it off her shoulders. "The sweater too. It's soaked through," he commanded, not looking at her face. Olivia hesitated, her arms crossing over her chest. The agency had warned her about the ranchers. They had warned her about isolation. But her body was failing her, violently trembling as pre-hypothermia set in. With agonizing slowness, she pulled the heavy, sodden sweater over her head. Underneath, she wore a thin cotton camisole that clung transparently to her skin. But it wasn't the damp fabric that made Liam freeze. It was the canvas of her skin. Along her ribs, fading yellow and purple blooms of old bruises mapped out a history of violence. Across her left shoulder blade, a jagged, poorly healed burn scar interrupted the pale skin. Liam's breath hitched. The clinical detachment in his eyes shattered, replaced by a dark, terrifying storm of recognition. He stared at the bruises, the muscle in his jaw ticking wildly. He had seen damage before. He knew exactly what it looked like when someone was treated like property. He didn't ask. He didn't demand explanations. He simply spun around, marched down the hall, and returned seconds later with a thick, dry wool blanket and an oversized, faded thermal shirt. He threw the blanket over her shoulders, cocooning her. "Put the shirt on. I'll make tea." He practically fled to the kitchen. An hour later, Olivia sat bundled by the roaring fire, a mug of scalding tea clamped in her hands. The violent shivering had subsided into a dull, exhausted tremor. Liam sat in an armchair opposite her, staring into the flames. He hadn't spoken since he handed her the mug. "His name is Marcus," Olivia finally whispered, the silence too heavy to bear. "My ex-boyfriend. He ran an illegal sports book. He used my name to open credit lines. When it collapsed, he owed the wrong people. He told them I had the money." Liam didn't look away from the fire. "I signed up with the agency because they offered immediate relocation to the middle of nowhere," she continued, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to bring them to your door. I thought I covered my tracks. I'll pack my things." "Your suitcase is broken," Liam said flatly. Olivia blinked, confused by the non sequitur. "I can use trash bags. I can't put you in danger. They'll come back." Liam slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The emptiness was gone. In its place was a quiet, terrifying resolve. "Let them. I've got an excavator and 5,000 acres. I can dig a hole deep enough that the devil himself wouldn't find them." He stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the room. "You signed a contract to clean my house and help me keep this ranch from the bank. You don't leave until the 6 months are up. Do you understand?" It wasn't a threat. It was a shield. For the first time in her life, a man had stood between her and the fire, and he hadn't asked for a damn thing in return. "I understand," she whispered. 4 days passed. The blizzard that followed the trespassers' departure locked them inside the house, burying the Blackwood Ranch under 3 feet of powder. The isolation, which had once felt oppressive, now felt like a fortress. The dynamic in the house had shifted. Liam was still a man of agonizingly few words, still retreating to the porch to stare out at the snow for hours at a time. But the hostility had evaporated. When she entered a room, he didn't tense. When she cleaned the kitchen, he stayed out of her way. On the 5th day, cabin fever pushed Olivia toward ambition. The pantry was stocked with basic staples, mostly flour, sugar, and canned goods. She decided to bake bread. She had never baked bread in her life, but the battered cookbook she found in a drawer made it look simple enough. It was not simple. By 2 in the afternoon, the kitchen looked like a war zone. Olivia was elbow deep in a sticky, unyielding mass of dough that refused to rise. She had flour on her nose, in her hair, and across the front of Liam's oversized flannel, which she had commandeered. She turned to the old vintage gas oven, attempting to shove the heavy cast-iron pan inside. The oven door had a broken spring. She knew this. Liam had warned her about it. But her hands were slick with oil and dough. As she leaned in, her grip slipped. The heavy pan slammed onto the rack. Startled, Olivia jerked backward. Her hip caught the heavy iron oven door. With a loud spang, the unsprung door snapped upward like a bear trap. It slammed shut, the sheer force of the impact launching a neglected, open 5-pound bag of flour resting on the stovetop straight into the air. It was a perfect, cinematic explosion. The bag hit the exhaust hood, burst completely open, and rained a thick, suffocating cloud of white powder directly over Olivia's head. She gasped, inhaling a lungful of flour, and immediately erupted into a violent fit of coughing and sneezing. She stumbled backward, wiping frantically at her eyes, blindly knocking over a stack of metal mixing bowls that clattered to the linoleum with a deafening racket. Heavy bootsteps pounded down the hall. Liam burst into the kitchen, his posture rigid, anticipating an attack or an injury. He stopped dead in his tracks. The flour dust was still settling in the air like a localized snowstorm. In the center of the kitchen stood Olivia. She was completely, uniformly white from head to toe. Her dark hair was plastered with white paste. Her eyelashes were caked. She looked like a startled ghost caught in the headlights. She froze, her hands hovering mid-air, clutching a dough-covered wooden spoon. She looked at Liam's wide eyes, her heart sinking. She had destroyed his kitchen. She had made a massive mess. She braced herself for the stoic fury, for the harsh reprimand. "I can clean it," she squeaked out, a small puff of white powder escaping her lips as she spoke. Liam stared at her. He looked at the flour on her nose. He looked at the dough glued to her fingers. He looked at the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of the woman standing in his kitchen. The corners of his mouth twitched. Olivia held her breath. Then, Liam's chest hitched. He pressed a massive hand over his mouth, turning his head away. But it was too late. A sound escaped him, a strange, choked rumble. He looked back at her, at the panicked, chalk-white raccoon expression on her face, and the dam finally broke. Liam threw his head back. A deep, baritone laugh tore from his chest. It was a rusty, booming sound, unpracticed and raw, vibrating off the wooden walls of the kitchen. It was the sound of a heavy iron vault finally swinging open. He braced his hands on his knees, his shoulders shaking, laughing until his eyes crinkled and the hardened lines of grief on his face completely vanished. Olivia stood paralyzed, the wooden spoon drooping in her hand. She stared at him, utterly captivated. When Liam smiled, he didn't look like a ghost anymore. He looked entirely, breathtakingly alive. He finally caught his breath, wiping a tear from his eye, pointing a shaking finger at her. You look like a damn powdered donut," he wheezed before dissolving into another chuckle. Olivia felt a strange, warm flutter in her chest. She looked down at herself, then back up at the massive, terrifying cowboy who was currently laughing so hard he was leaning against the doorframe for support. Slowly, tentatively, Olivia smiled back. And for the first time in years, the house on Blackwood Ranch felt like a home. The laughter in the kitchen had broken a seal. In the weeks that followed, the Blackwood Ranch didn't suddenly become a place of joyous conversation, but the agonizing, suffocating silence was gone. It was replaced by a comfortable, working quiet. Liam began showing Olivia how to mend tack. Olivia began leaving hot coffee on the porch railing before his dawn rounds. They were two battered ships navigating the same dark waters, finally acknowledging the other's presence. But the door at the end of the hall remained closed. It was a physical manifestation of the boundary Liam had drawn on her very first day. Until the second week of April, the spring thaw had turned the ranch into a sea of mud, and a sudden, violent squall had blown through the valley. Olivia was in the hallway, carrying a stack of freshly laundered towels, when a massive gust of wind rattled the farmhouse. The change in air pressure popped the latch on the heavy oak door at the end of the hall. It creaked open, revealing a sliver of the darkness within. Olivia froze. Never open that. His warning echoed in her mind, sharp and absolute. She stepped forward to pull it shut, keeping her eyes averted. But as her hand grasped the brass knob, the scent hit her. It didn't smell like a nursery. It didn't smell like a shrine to a lost lover. It smelled distinctly of rubbing alcohol, stale lavender, and the faint, unmistakable metallic tang of sterile medical equipment. Curiosity, heavy and morbid, overrode her survival instincts. She pushed the door open just a few inches more. The room was bathed in the gray light of the storm. In the center sat a mechanical hospital bed, its rails raised like a cage. To the left, an IV stand gathered dust. On the heavy oak dresser, instead of jewelry or photos, sat perfectly aligned rows of amber prescription bottles, a pulse oximeter, and a thick, terrifying stack of past-due medical bills stamped in red ink. It wasn't a room of sudden tragedy. It was a room of prolonged, agonizing defeat. "I told you not to go in there." Olivia violently jumped, dropping the towels. Liam was standing at the end of the hallway, dripping wet from the rain. His face was unreadable, cast in shadow, his massive frame blocking the only exit. "The wind," Olivia stammered, backing away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It blew open. I was just shutting it. I swear, Liam, I didn't mean to—" "Stop apologizing," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It was unspeakably tired. He walked slowly down the hall, his boots leaving wet tracks on the hardwood. He didn't look at her as he passed, stepping into the room. He reached out and touched the cold metal rail of the hospital bed. His massive hand, capable of breaking a man's wrist, looked agonizingly gentle against the steel. "Her name was Sarah," he said softly, staring at the empty mattress. "We were married out of high school. 5 years ago, her hand started shaking. The doctors called it early onset ALS, fast and aggressive." Olivia stood frozen in the doorway. The breath caught in her throat. "I thought if I just worked harder, I could save her," Liam continued, his voice cracking like dry timber. "I sold the lower herd. I took out a second mortgage to pay for the experimental treatments. Then a third mortgage just to keep the lights on for the oxygen machines. I stayed awake for 4 days straight toward the end, terrified she'd stop breathing if I closed my eyes." He finally looked up at Olivia, his eyes completely hollowed out by the memory. "She died anyway. And the bank told me I had 6 months to show a dual-income household, or they'd foreclose on the land that's been in my family for 4 generations. The fragmented pieces clicked together in Olivia's mind. The agency, the strict contract, the absolute lack of romance. It wasn't about a mail-order bride. It was a desperate, bureaucratic Hail Mary to save the only thing he had left. "Liam," Olivia whispered, stepping into the room. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it was going to be okay. She just walked up beside him and placed her small, warm hand over his massive, trembling knuckles resting on the bed rail. For the first time since she had arrived, Liam didn't flinch away from the contact. He closed his eyes, his head bowing slightly, taking a deep, shuddering breath. In the silent room, surrounded by the ghosts of his failure, the simple warmth of her hand anchored him to the present. By late May, the valley was green, and the contract had exactly 2 weeks remaining. The $60,000 Olivia owed the syndicate had been systematically paid off through the agency's escrow, a detail Liam had handled with grim, administrative silence. She was technically almost free, but men like Marcus didn't care about technicalities. They cared about ownership. It happened on a Tuesday. Liam had taken the tractor to the far north pasture to clear a downed pine tree. Olivia was on the wraparound porch, sanding down a rocking chair she was refinishing, when a silver Mercedes sedan rolled up the driveway. It wasn't Goons this time. It was Marcus. He stepped out of the car, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that looked absurd against the backdrop of the rugged Montana mountains. He looked older, sharper, and dangerously calm. Olivia dropped the sandpaper. Her pulse instantly spiked to a frantic, terrifying rhythm. Every instinct screamed at her to run into the house, to lock the doors, to hide. But she looked at the newly painted porch railings. She looked at the blue cornflowers she had planted in pots by the stairs. This was her home. She stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans, refusing to back away. "Livy," Marcus said smoothly, walking toward the porch. "Look at you, playing house in the mud." I have to admit, when Vince came back with a broken wrist, I was intrigued. "The debt is paid, Marcus," Olivia said, her voice trembling slightly, though she locked her knees to stay upright. "The agency wired the final installment yesterday. You have no business here." Marcus stopped at the bottom of the steps, pulling a folded document from his breast pocket. "You paid the principal, sweetheart. You forgot about the interest and the inconvenience fee for breaking Vince's arm. You're coming back to Chicago. You can work it off in the VIP room. Get your coat." He took a step up. Olivia didn't hesitate. She reached behind the porch pillar, her hand closing around the cold, heavy steel of the 12-gauge shotgun Liam kept propped there for coyotes. In one fluid motion, she leveled the barrel directly at Marcus's chest. She pumped the action. The heavy clack-clack of a shell chambering echoed like a thunderclap across the quiet yard. Marcus froze, his arrogant smile faltering for a fraction of a second before returning. "You don't have the stomach to pull that trigger, Livy." "I didn't," she said, her voice dropping into a low, dead calm register that sounded terrifyingly like Liam. "But I've learned a lot about pest control lately. Take one more step." Before Marcus could test her bluff, the ground began to vibrate. A deep mechanical roar ripped through the air, drowning out the wind. From the tree line emerged Liam's massive yellow John Deere excavator, its steel treads tearing up the mud as it barreled toward the driveway at top speed. Marcus spun around, dropping the document, his eyes going wide. Liam didn't slow down. He drove the 30-ton machine straight toward the silver Mercedes. At the last possible second, he pulled a lever. The massive steel bucket swung downward with devastating, crushing force, slamming directly onto the hood of the luxury sedan. The crunch of metal and shattering glass was deafening. The car's frame buckled in half like a stepped-on tin can. Liam cut the engine. He stepped out of the cab, vaulted over the mangled wreckage of the car, and walked toward Marcus. He didn't have a wrench this time. He didn't need one. Marcus scrambled backward, suddenly looking very small in his tailored suit. "I told your boys," Liam said, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "I've got an excavator." Liam stopped inches from Marcus. "The sheriff is a mile down the road. He's been waiting for you to cross county lines. You have two choices. You can start walking toward the highway to meet him, or you can get under the bucket." Marcus looked at the crushed metal of his car, then at the massive, unyielding rancher, and finally at Olivia, who still held the shotgun steady. The predator realized he had walked into a den of wolves. Without a word, he turned and began a long, humiliating walk down the muddy driveway. Liam watched him go until he was a speck in the distance. Then, he turned to Olivia. He looked at the shotgun in her hands, her steady stance, and the fierce fire in her eyes. "Safety's on," he noted quietly. Olivia blinked, looking down at the gun. She let out a breathless, shaky laugh, leaning it back against the pillar. "I guess I have more to learn." The 1st of June arrived with a cruel, bright sunrise. The 6-month contract had officially expired at midnight. The bank loan was secured. The syndicate was gone. The transaction was complete. Olivia's cheap, hard-shell suitcase, carefully repaired with a strip of silver duct tape, sat by the front door. She wore her city clothes, which felt foreign and tight after months of flannel and denim. She stood in the kitchen, staring at a brand-new blue cornflower mug sitting perfectly centered on the counter. Liam had driven 2 hours to Billings to find a replica. Heavy footsteps sounded behind her. Liam walked into the kitchen. He was dressed in his work clothes, but he wasn't heading out to the pastures. He stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The silence between them was deafening, heavier than it had been on that first drive from the bus station. "Agency called," Liam said, his voice rough. "Bus leaves at noon. I can drive you into town." Olivia gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. "Right, the contract is up." "It is," Liam agreed, his jaw tight. He looked at the suitcase by the door, and a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. "I fixed the porch step," Olivia said, her voice barely a whisper. "And the ledger for the feed supplier is updated on the desk." I saw. They stood there, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them. She had saved his ranch from the bank. He had saved her life. They had fulfilled the terms of the paper they signed in Chicago. Olivia picked up her purse. She forced herself to turn and look at him. "Thank you, Liam, for everything." She walked past him, her heart shattering with every step. She reached the front door and wrapped her hand around the taped handle of her suitcase. "Leave it!" Liam's voice cracked through the quiet hallway. Olivia froze. She turned back. Liam had closed the distance. He stood inches from her, his massive frame radiating a desperate, terrifying heat. The stoic, unyielding mask was completely gone. In its place was a man violently clawing his way back to life, terrified of letting the light go out again. "The contract is up," Liam said, his voice dropping to a raw, breathless gravel. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently gripping her wrist, pulling her hand away from the suitcase. "The bank is happy. The debt is paid. Everything we were forced to do is done." He looked down into her eyes, the vulnerability in his gaze absolute and devastating. "So now," he whispered, his thumb gently tracing the pulse at her wrist, "I'm asking you to stay, because I want you to. Because this house is just a graveyard without you in it." Olivia stared at him, the air leaving her lungs. She looked at the man who had swept up her broken pieces, who had stood between her and a loaded gun, who had laughed in a cloud of flour until the ghosts had finally fled the room. She let go of the suitcase. It hit the floor with a dull thud. "I'm terrible at baking bread," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. Liam's chest hitched. He reached up, his rough hands framing her face with agonizing care, wiping the tear away with his thumb. "Good," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "I hate bread." When he kissed her, it wasn't a sudden, cinematic crash of passion. It was slow, profound, and deeply reverent. It was the undeniable feeling of two people who had survived the absolute worst of the world, finally coming home. The Blackwood Ranch eventually reclaimed its former glory, the peeling paint replaced, the fences standing tall against the Absaroka winds. The door at the end of the hall was eventually opened, the medical equipment cleared away to make room for a sturdy crib, built by hands that knew the exact value of a second chance. Liam and Olivia didn't just survive their pasts, they built a fortress over them, rooted in the fierce, unyielding love they chose when the paperwork ran out. If Liam and Olivia's journey from darkness back to life touched your heart, please leave a like. Share this story with someone who needs to believe in second chances, and subscribe for more grounded, emotional, dramatic fiction. Let me know in the comments what your favorite moment was. 18 months after the agency contract expired, the Blackwood Ranch had transformed. It wasn't a miraculous, overnight restoration of a multi-million-dollar estate. It was a slow, grueling resurrection built on calloused hands, shared coffee, and the quiet, unbreakable bond that had forged itself between Liam and Olivia. The fences were mended, the lower herd had been repurchased, and the oppressive, suffocating silence of the house had been replaced by the soft hum of the radio and the warmth of a wood stove that never went cold. And in the room at the end of the hall, the faint smell of sterile alcohol had been entirely scrubbed away, replaced by the scent of fresh pine and lavender oil. The sturdy oak crib Liam had built with his own hands sat in the center, waiting. Olivia was 8.5 months pregnant, and she carried the child with the fierce, protective grace of a woman who knew exactly what a miracle looked like. But Montana did not care about miracles. Montana only cared about the seasons, and this winter was shaping up to be apocalyptic. The radio in the kitchen had been crackling with emergency broadcasts since 4 a.m. A massive Arctic front, a bomb cyclone, was hurtling over the Absaroka Range, bringing with it a forecasted 40 inches of snow and wind chills that could drop to 50 below zero. It was the kind of storm that didn't just freeze the land, it shattered it. Liam stood by the back door, layering on his heaviest insulated canvas gear. The lines around his eyes, which had softened over the past year and a half, were drawn tight again. The ghost of the grieving cowboy flickered in his rigid posture. "The lower pasture gate is frozen shut," Liam said, his voice a low rumble over the howling wind outside. He pulled a thick wool neck gaiter over his head. "I have to take the tractor down and smash it open. If I don't move the herd into the southern ravine before the whiteout hits, they'll freeze standing up." Olivia walked heavily into the mudroom, wrapping a thick cardigan around her swollen belly. She didn't ask him not to go. She knew the ranch. She knew what those animals meant to their livelihood. "How long?" "2 hours. 3 max," Liam said, turning to look at her. He stripped off his heavy leather work glove just to press his bare palm against her cheek. His hand was already cold, but his eyes were burning with a desperate, protective fire. "Keep the generator primed. If the grid goes down, I want that switch flipped immediately. Stay by the fire. Do not step foot on that porch, Liv. The ice is already an inch thick." "I'm pregnant, Liam, not helpless." She managed a small, brave smile, leaning into his touch. "Just come back to me. The baby is kicking like a Mustang this morning." Liam dropped his gaze to her stomach, a profound, almost painful reverence crossing his features. He leaned down, pressing a lingering kiss to her forehead. "I'll be back before the worst of it hits, I promise." He stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The wind instantly snatched the heavy oak door from his grip, slamming it shut behind him. Olivia stood alone in the hallway, listening to the deep, guttural roar of the diesel tractor firing up. She watched through the frosted glass as the twin yellow headlights cut a swath through the driving, horizontal snow, slowly disappearing into the suffocating white void. By noon, the worst of it had officially arrived, and Liam had not returned. The sky didn't just turn dark, it turned the color of bruised iron. The wind was no longer a howl. It was a physical, concussive force that shook the log cabin down to its stone foundation. The snow was falling so thickly that Olivia couldn't see the porch railing from the living room window. At 12:45 p.m., the lights flickered, hummed violently, and died. The sudden silence from the refrigerator and the furnace was deafening. Olivia didn't panic. Liam had taught her well. She grabbed the heavy Maglite flashlight from the counter, pulled on her snow boots, and waddled to the attached utility shed to fire up the diesel generator. She flipped the master breaker, turned the ignition key, and breathed a sigh of relief as the engine sputtered and roared to life, sending electricity pulsing back into the house. She walked back into the kitchen, rubbing her lower back. A dull, heavy ache had been building at the base of her spine for the last hour. She attributed it to the stress, the drop in barometric pressure, the heavy boots. She reached for the radio to check the emergency broadcast. As her hand touched the dial, a sharp, agonizing cramp ripped across her abdomen. It wasn't a dull ache. It was a vice grip of pure, breathless pain that buckled her knees. Olivia gasped, clutching the edge of the counter as the flashlight clattered to the floor. The pain peaked, held for terrifying 10 seconds, and slowly receded, leaving her panting in the dim light of the kitchen. She looked down at the puddle of water rapidly expanding across the linoleum floor. Her water had just broken, 3 weeks early, in the middle of the worst blizzard in a century, and Liam was out in the whiteout. A mile and a half down in the valley, Liam was fighting a losing battle against nature. The tractor had done its job. He had smashed the frozen gate and driven the terrified, bellowing herd into the natural windbreak of the southern ravine. But the storm had escalated faster than the meteorologists had predicted. The temperature had plummeted 20 degrees in 30 minutes. As he turned the heavy machinery around to head back up the incline toward the main house, the engine gave a sickly, metallic cough. The diesel fuel, despite being treated with anti-gel, was beginning to freeze in the lines due to the sheer, catastrophic wind chill. The tractor shuddered violently, spat a cloud of black smoke into the swirling snow, and died. Liam sat in the freezing cab, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. "No, no, no, no!" He twisted the ignition key. Nothing. Not even a click. He looked out the windshield. The visibility was zero. He couldn't see the hood of the tractor. The wind was screaming, a high-pitched, demonic wail that drowned out every other sound. If he stayed in the cab without the heater running, the steel box would become a coffin within 2 hours. If he stepped out into the whiteout, he could wander off the road and freeze to death in minutes. But Olivia was in the house. The power lines along the ridge had been violently swaying when he left. Liam didn't hesitate. He grabbed the emergency flare gun, his heavy canvas survival bag, and pushed the cab door open. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly throwing him backward. It felt like being repeatedly struck with tiny shards of glass. He dropped to the ground, the snow already waist-deep. He knew this land. He knew every dip, every fence post, every tree line. He had to navigate by memory and touch.